tax law podcast for corporate policyholders. I'm Vince Morgan. All right, so Steve Melendi from Tollefson Bradley Mitchell Melendi is our special guest today, who's in town for a hearing. And our office, those of you who don't know, our listeners, our office is a couple of blocks away from the federal courthouse here in Houston. And Steve had a hearing earlier this morning and stopped by this afternoon to come visit with our team. So, Steve, welcome to Covered. Nice to see you.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the free snacks.
You are most welcome. We have actually an unlimited supply. So if you feel you need nourishment at any point during this podcast, just let me know and we'll take care of that.
I got it. So if I want a break, I raise my hand. You ask one question, the usual stuff.
Well, yes. Well, hopefully you'll finish the question that's been asked and then we'll take a break. Okay. Yeah. Just like a deposition, right? So let me start by saying, how was your hearing this morning? How'd that go?
My hearing this morning was fine. It was a status conference in front of the new federal judge that got the case when the old federal judge retired. And he literally started with, okay, what's this case about? Where there's pending cross motions for summary judgment.
Well, that's as good a question as any, right?
It was nice. And it was, low stress. So I'm always a fan of low stress hearings.
Right. I do understand. Now, we've had our own hearings in the past, and we'll talk about some of that here in a little bit. But I'm delighted to have you here. And what we usually do is we ask our guests who come from, all aspects of the insurance and risk management space. And we've had risk managers, we've had in-house general counsel, we've had brokers, we've had outside lawyers in the past, we've had an in-house claims manager at one of your clients join our podcast once. We called that Tales from the Other Side. So this will be something like Tales from the Other Side, etc. But one thing we always ask is how you ended up where you're at. How did you get into insurance and how has your career evolved?
Well, just kind of like how I ended up at law school was I just kind of fell into insurance. I ended up in law school because after college, I got a real job for a couple of months and just getting up in the morning was just more than my 23-year-old mind could handle. So I went back to school.
You thought law school would be a respite?
Yeah, I did. I thought it at least would be a stay of execution, right? As a friend of mine at the time, I guess still a friend of mine, said one day, he said, living your life from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. ain't no living. So I got a clerkship at a now defunct law firm after my second year where one of the partners did some insurance coverage work. I got that clerkship because they were willing to give me one. And at the time, I thought he was just, thought I had a keen intellect and was interested in working with me. I learned later that his crazy and my crazy somehow kind of meshed. And I fell into it. I think a lot of people do with insurance. I don't think there's a lot of people that come out of college or law school thinking, I want to be an insurance lawyer. Or what I want to do is handle insurance claims. I know you like to claim that you came out of law school wanting to be an insurance lawyer. I think that you came out of law school wanting to work at where the people that were there happened to do insurance.
You think?
So think about that. Yes.
Well, I was talking with somebody yesterday and they said, there weren't any insurance classes when they went to law school. And I said, well, for me, I was lucky because in my law school, there happened to be two. And I went to one of the larger law schools in the country. And so they had sort of more class selection than some other law schools. So we were blessed with that. But I was really happy to have a couple of insurance classes. And I kind of knew then that this was for me. And in fact, one of your partners, who's been one of our past guests, Beth Bradley, she told me that she interviewed me when I was in law school. You may have heard the story a couple hundred times. But one of the things she said was, you're the first person I've ever interviewed who actually knows what it is I do. And which was amazing. So that's great. All right. So you ended up.
And then she didn't give you a job, right?
Well, I know we don't need
That's
to go
the
into
end of
that.
the story.
Yeah. But the good news is, 20 years later, they came back and offered me a job. So, better late than never. Right. But so you ended up with it. And then what's always been interesting to me is that we actually were working on the same stuff together without even knowing it when we were very early in our careers.
That's true.
Yeah. Didn't figure that out till later, which was a surprising, interesting thing. I guess it's maybe not so uncommon. I like to think that our young associates, our younger lawyers, get to know the lawyers on the other side of my cases, but I'm not sure. There probably are matters I work on where it's just, the interaction is at a higher, sort of more senior folks. I don't know.
I think it's easier now. I'm thinking back to 20 plus years ago. not everything was via email. Forget about the last couple of years and Zoom hearings and that kind of stuff that you could, it's one of the advantages of remote hearings is it's a lot easier to let your young associate watch an out-of-town hearing with you, right?
Yep, sure.
I think that there was a lot less communicating electronically on cases in those days. And, at least I was just stuck in the physical library or looking at Westlaw in my office as opposed to actually, going out there and, being part of it. So I do think that there's probably a little more interaction amongst the young lawyers now. I encourage my associates to, get out there and interact. And if there's an opening for them to reach out to the other young lawyer in the case to do it, so that they can, meet that person and not, learn 15 years later that they were involved in the same fairly wild case 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's a fair way of saying it. And I was interested to hear that you were in the library doing research because I would have sworn all you did in that case was draft complaints because there were like 5 lawsuits.
I did that. And I had another case at the same time that you were not involved in where I drafted complaints in 6 to 8 states. And that was, you think about things you learn along the way that you hope can impart wisdom. And in that case, despite my then, leader / mentor / boss, now partner telling me, why don't you number these exhibits instead of using letters? I didn't do it. And sure. So, by the time we got in one of them to the second motion for summary judgment, I was on exhibit CC. And, that was one of those kind of
sure.
cases as well. But I did used to go sit and, we had at that firm, we had, a good sized library with, big tables in it. So I used to go in there sometimes because every now and then it was easier to go look at the actual key number books as opposed to look at what Westlaw 95 or whatever it was called at that time. It was older than what they now call Westlaw Classic, right?
Right.
It was easier to go look at like what was the next keynote on paper than it was electronically. So sometimes I did go in there and try to, embiggen my knowledge a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I used to go hang out in the library too. And, it was amazing what you could find in there. Did you, at the time then, did you have a sign somewhere on your stacks that said old stuff nobody reads?
No.
So that's new.
It's because they hadn't invented magic markers that we can use that for now at the office. And I like how you put the clean version of what that sign says and called it stuff.
We're a respectable podcast
appreciate
here. Yeah.
I'm sure that all of your audience wants a PG kind of show.
Well, we try and deliver. I mean, keep your audience in mind, right? So no, I do remember. I think I took a picture of that. And in fact, I actually relied on the Tollefson Bradley library resources recently. I called Bradley and asked for something, and she was always willing to accommodate. It was very nice of her. So we worked on a crazy case and then for a while we didn't, I don't think we crossed paths very much every now and then. And then more recently, right before COVID started, we actually had one where we squared off head to head, which was, a super interesting case. And I don't want to talk about all the amazing arguments that, that were offered there. But, what I do think is really important, and this is kind of where we're going next is, and it doesn't matter who did this for the other, but what I thought was really nice about that case is a couple things, and this, that number one, somebody asked for an extension on a brief, and one of us asked for an extension, and the other one said, of course, and there was no paperwork at all of any kind documenting that extension. Right? It was asked for, it was given. There was nothing to memorialize it. It was simply done, on nothing other than the word given on a phone call, and that is to us seems like that's how it ought to be. But that really is an extraordinary level of trust and comfort. And so I think, I hope that our listeners, work with lawyers who, have that kind of relationship with their opposing counsel, because that's sort of the best way that ought to be. The other thing that I remember about that case is, we sat there, we got there. This is when we used to go to the courthouse for a hearing. And we got there about an hour or so early, because it's, you don't know when your case is going to get reached. And then we watched the judge play kindergarten cop for an hour and a half.
More than that. Yeah. I mean, we were an hour early for the hearing, and both of the other lawyers from your office too were an hour early.
Sure.
I want the record to be clear that like most times you had 3 lawyers there and I was by myself. Mm-hmm. Just myself and,
understand.
My thoughts.
Yeah, it's what we call training. Let's see, we bring our associates to the hearing so they can watch and see how these things go. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah.
I also had no demonstrative exhibits for an MSJ hearing.
Yeah, which I did not use either.
Okay.
Yes, I had one with me. I had a blow up of your endorsement creating coverage. Sorry, your client's endorsement creating coverage. I did have a blow up of that, but the judge didn't need it. He got to the right answer without that.
Hours later, he convinced himself of the wrong conclusion. That's accurate. I would say, what your point about the kindergarten cop part is really something that, I'm hopeful as we get back to in-person hearings, right? And I had one, in federal court this morning, and I had a, federal bench trial last week. I think that will show some people how other lawyers behave. And I think that's a really important thing because the kindergarten cop is accurate. I mean, you sit there, and in the case we're talking about was in state court in Harris County, and you're sitting there and, the first 3-4 hearings are pretty simple, discovery disputes that shouldn't take motions and shouldn't take getting to the courthouse. And by the time you get to the courthouse, by the time the judge looks at everybody a couple of times, all of a sudden everything's okay, right? And then there was some very serious fighting about, the judge called one of them childish, I think, and that it was, just really not anything worth fighting about. And the amount of time and money that was spent on those kind of little fights, I feel like really does a disservice to people's clients. And I admit this hearing was, and this goes back to the giving an extension. This hearing was like January 3rd or 4th of 2020. I don't remember which day it was. I remember it was the first Monday or Tuesday of the new year, because part of the extension issue was it was like right during Christmas and New Year's, and it was a reply to a response to a summary judgment, right? So dragging someone to court to argue about something that after 30 minutes, the judge is frustrated and tells everybody that they're being childish at 8 a.m. in the first day or two of the new year doesn't seem like the way one ought to be practicing law.
No,
to me. Right. I'm not talking about our hearing. This was a very big case. It was a part of a case that we'd been to mediation a couple of times. It was probably a 30-party case. There was a companion coverage case. There was a lot going on with that. And I also think if I had said, hey, can we move this like a week? If the judge would have had a hearing, you probably would have agreed. That wasn't it. It was, I think the next hearing was 6 weeks later.
Right. Yeah. And in fact, we did talk about that, and we checked to find out when the next hearing was, and it was like 6 weeks later. And our motion had been, pending for months at that point. And our client was like, look, we want to see a decision here. And what was, Sue, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that, the watching what we had to watch before we got called was really awful. And so when we got up there, we apologized to the judge just on behalf of the bar for him having to wade through that stuff. And then we said, listen, we're friends. We are each going to do our level best to win here and beat the other side. But whatever you decide, we're still going to go out to, have dinner tonight. And we might kick each other in the shins, but I promise you it's good, clean fun. And nothing that happens here today is going to change that. And I think the judge, you could just see, sort of like him relax from, being tense with all the, garbage he had to deal with beforehand.
For sure. Especially once, it was a summary judgment hearing, so you didn't need a record anyway. Once he confirmed that we didn't want a record, he very much took part in the argument in a really engaging way, would ask his own questions, would cut everybody off. And, I think it made it a fairly interactive hearing. Now, it might've been what made it turn into 2 hours, or at least it felt like 2 hours. Well, and I had it won for most of the hearing.
He totally did. He started out with, I just want to tell you, I said, Your Honor, it's my motion. And he says, that's fine. I just want to tell you two things. Number one, English is not my first language. And of course, this whole thing was on what do you guys call it? A picayune rule of contract construction. And then the second thing is I like his argument better than yours. I'm like, okay, I got things right where I want them. And I was behind that entire hearing until the very end. On like the eighth way I tried to articulate something, it finally resonated. And I'm like, okay, I've now been able, I guess, to find the way to articulate it in a way. Because sometimes, people, you can explain the same thing 3 or 4 different ways. And one way makes perfect sense to somebody, but the others don't. And, one of the others can make perfect sense to somebody else. And so you kind of have to be prepared to go and kind of get at it from different ways. And I think, by having us have enough time to sort of have a thorough discussion, obviously the judge got to the right result. So I'm delighted by that. But anyway, so that was...
The case was resolved, the case was resolved before that ruling became a final ruling. So, who got the right result? The right result was both of our clients got a resolution that they could tolerate.
That's right.
So in that sense, it was resolved properly.
Yes, I agree with that as well. So, all right. So we've talked about kind of what does work. We've talked about kind of how you got to where you're at. Let me ask you, you have a very successful carrier side practice there in Dallas, but it's nationwide. I mean, we work on, I guess we've got another matter now that's pending, right, where we're involved and it's new, hasn't gotten off the ground much yet, but have another chance to work together. Tell me, what has been your experience in working, where you see things break down among lawyers? Again, so for us, we can ask for, whatever courtesy or favor you might need, and it's given freely and without condition, without, documentation, without extracting some equivalent favor or thing. I mean, it's just, of course, sure. And where do you see, I mean, we've worked together and spoken together, and, even though we're on the other side, it's always been a good working relationship. Where do you see things go wrong when some of the lawyers you deal with?
I see things, the two things where I see things go wrong are, one, lawyers who refuse to actually talk to the other lawyers. Mm-hmm. There is a type of lawyer and there's lawyers who represent claimants, policyholders, carriers. It runs the gamut. They exist in all nooks and crannies in this world, and they refuse to meaningfully talk to the other lawyer. I mean, you'll get they won't ever answer your phone call. If you leave them a message, you'll get an email back, or that they'll call at 6, right?
Sure.
Hoping you don't answer.
Yeah.
And it's because they don't want you to ask them any questions, I think.
Right.
And sometimes it's because they don't know much about the case. There's one of the questions I get asked a lot about policyholder lawyers is, sometimes, some policyholder lawyers file or put things in pleadings that seem odd, or say things in depositions that seem odd. Sometimes they do it because they're odd. Sometimes they do it because they're very, very smart and they're trying to confuse you, right? And sometimes they do it because they just don't know much about their case. It's the ones that don't know much about their case are oftentimes the ones that don't want to talk to you. They don't want to take a position because they haven't really done an investigation into what's going on. And, the question I get asked when I tell my clients, look, this guy by reputation or this person by reputation is that way. The next question is it that they just aren't paying attention, or is it that they just don't get it? And there's some of both, right? I mean, I had this exact discussion yesterday about a lawyer who I told my client, I said, look, she is a very, very good lawyer. She's really, really smart. You can tell she's not paying attention to this case. She's going to figure out. So can't sit back and, just assume that everything's going to work, that she's not going to find this argument. She just hasn't yet. So that's the thing where I think people go wrong, is not talking. And, I counsel my clients, to talk to insureds as well, right? Like before lawyers are involved and you're at the claim stage, people are so, people, when you get them talking, will oftentimes answer questions that you don't even know, right? I mean, think about taking a deposition. Your goal is to get the other side to say something other than yes, no, I don't know, maybe. Right. The goal is to get them talking. I mean, I had an associate once who really, really mastered uncomfortable silence. Right.
That's a good skill.
Like he used it as a way to get the partners to tell him the answer and do his work for him. Right. Sure. And I thought it was really, as much as I disliked it, I believed that there was some amount of credibility there. The ability to sit in a partner's office as a young lawyer and look dumbfounded when they asked you a direct question until the partner eventually gives up and basically answers the question for them. Right.
Do they look at you and tilt their head like a dog, or do they just kind of stare?
This one did not. I mean, that kind of making sad things is just willing to sit there and stare. And he could use it in deposition to get somebody, it's easy to get an expert talking, right? But he could use it in depth. He was good at it in depositions to just sit there looking at the deponent until they just eventually couldn't take it and would keep talking. People that know that's what people that don't know that much of that case, that's what they're afraid of, right? So you don't be afraid of that, because the other side doesn't know everything either, as much as they might tell you they do. The other thing I think that lawyers do wrong with each other is not treat the other side like they're humans, in the sense that, I had a case several years ago where we had a situation where like the lawyer that was working on the file was very, very sick and, couldn't go to a hearing. And the other side's response to that was somewhere between, I don't believe you, and, my client says they don't care. And we had to have a hearing where, one of my other partners had to go to the hearing, and I was there and had to go to the hearing, explain the health situation. And the judge took it pretty harsh, was going to be very harsh with them if they didn't, resolve this a little bit. And I'm trying not to get too deep into it, but acting as if the person on the other side of you is a human, because, what goes around comes around, right? I mean, I had a lawyer in a case once who every time there was a hearing, and it was a Houston case, and I was in Dallas, and this other lawyer was in Houston. It was in state court, and there was a lot of parties, and there was a lot of hearings. Without fail, anytime there was a tough hearing, the afternoon before, his assistant would call and would say he was sick. And when she was clearly too embarrassed to say he was sick, it turned into his kid was sick. And, some of the other lawyers in that case just didn't believe him. I didn't believe him. But I was like, I'm not going to go down to the courthouse and say his secretary told me that his kid is sick and so he wants to reschedule. That just didn't seem like the right way to go. And he might have been making it up and taking advantage of it. That we eventually got to the right result in the case. But my fear is always that if I start thinking, I don't believe you, you've got, 400 lawyers at your firm, Vince, somebody can cover this tomorrow. They may not be as smart as you, but I'm going to use that to my advantage, that's going to come back to bite me, whether it's the judge thinking I'm a jerk or, just some kind of cosmic, restitution.
Right. I agree with those things too. What's interesting to me is if you look at, the American political discourse today, those same two things are, sort of our problem more generally, right? Is that people aren't really talking to each other. They're talking at each other, past each other. And they somehow aren't treating the other side as if they're regular, everyday, normal, people too, right? And it's turned into, if you don't agree with me, then you're a bad person, right? Wherever you're at. I mean, I don't feel that way, but I think too many people these days do. And I think if we get back to sort of actually trying to understand what people think and why, things might work a lot better. So who knows? Maybe it would be shocking if two lawyers could solve America's political discourse. But
I think it would take a lot more than two.
Yeah.
To solve it. And that's, not a lawyer light bulb joke.
Right.
Although there might be one in there somewhere.
Probably is, yeah.
But, I think it would be good. I think if people would stop and take a breath and think about, these are and still in fact people on the other side, and they're not all bad, right? I mean, there's, and I imagine you see this, on your side of insurance disputes, I see some people who, no matter what my client did, will think that my client is bad.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And I'm not here to tell you that all insurance companies are great people. I'm here to tell you that, my clients are all great people.
Sure. Just the ones you represent.
But
right.
That's right. And there's lots of good ones that I don't represent either. There are, some maybe that aren't. A lot of what I do involves, is carrier to carrier disputes, which I know you have a distaste for, but not everybody is all bad. Like you were saying, I think if people worked more at trying to see what the real dispute is, as opposed to what is everything that's in play, you might really get down to it pretty, I don't want to say quickly, because that's, I think, a little naive, but it would at least narrow the issue a little bit. I mean, what are we really arguing about here, right? And to try to distill it down that way.
Right. No, I agree. And it seems hard to solve problems if you can't agree on some of these basic concepts. And that's true for litigation. It's true for politics. It's true for all kinds of other things. All right. Well, so maybe we'll work on trying to solve that bigger problem later. I think we can get more than two lawyers to join this cause. It's important enough. I think we can get there. So tell me, one thing we always like to ask our guests is tell us about the craziest insurance claim you have seen in your career. Now, I know some of them because I've been involved in some of them, but you need not limit it to matters that we worked on together. So tell me if you can pick one, what is the craziest claim you've ever dealt with?
Man, so I'm dealing with one right now that I don't want to talk about because it is still pending, and
sure.
It's been in Law 360 more than once, and I don't want to bring it up.
Okay,
but
besides that one, and besides some of the ones we've already mentioned a little bit, because I don't know that there's enough time.
I was involved in a group of cases that involved not an insured. These were cases involving somewhere between, I don't even know that it was ever resolved before I got done with my part of it, somewhere between half a dozen and 20 killings, where the claim was, and they were all elderly individuals, most of whom's death was originally ruled as just natural causes, who the claim became that this one person was in fact a serial killer. And I say I got out of this because what happened in the middle of all of this is a big chunk of these happened at one premises, let's call it. This was it's not a nursing home case, at this one premises. And my part of this ended while this was still going on, because as no relation to this, my client's insured sold that property to somebody else. And so obviously when they sold that property, that policy was canceled, right? Because when you own a bunch of different properties, as soon as you sell it, you take it off the schedule on your coverages. But what was crazy about it was, they kind of had to go in and recreate what happened here, because every one of these were declared as just an elderly individual just does not wake up. And it turned into there might have been a serial killer. And then the second part of it was this, again, when I say it was not a nursing home is important, because this is a third party outside individual. What is, my client's insured, who is the premises owner, what's their real liability if in a situation where there's no forced entry, somebody comes in and kills somebody, where the deceased person had to have opened the door for him. So what's the real liability? So on the one hand, my client's going, how on earth is our insured liable for this? And the insured is saying, how on earth am I liable for this? But at the same time, what's a jury going to think? Are they going to blame somebody? And it's absolutely a covered claim on these policies. I mean, my role in this was was halfway just being the insurance company's lawyer and halfway to deal with the inherent issues of how many claimants do we have? What are these claims really worth? Who's going to tender up to whom and so forth. So that was a pretty wild, set of facts.
Yeah, serial killer is a new one. We have heard a few interesting claims, but I think you're the first with a serial killer. So I hate to reward that with a special gift, but
do I get a platinum star, or what do I get? It just
seems wrong, but you didn't kill anybody. I understand that. I mean, you just kill people's hopes and dreams of getting coverage, and you do that every day.
I just reminded them of what they elected to purchase. Okay.
Sure. Right. Okay.
Most of my clients would gladly sell more insurance.
Would they?
For more money.
Would they?
Most of them. Yeah. I have some that won't.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm gonna remember that. That's good to know. Helpful. I'll pass that on to ours. All right. Last question for you, Mr. Melendi. What would you tell, I know you're very active in the bar, you speak at CLE presentations several times a year, conferences and other things like that. You are active in the insurance law section of the State Bar of Texas and have some other professional association activities. What would you, or let me ask it this way, would you encourage a young lawyer these days to kind of do those kinds of things? Or would you say focus on your work? I mean, what advice would you give, looking back on your career, what advice would you give to your younger self at this point?
Well, if we could get past the advice of try hard enough in college to get an engineering degree so that you could go take the patent bar, because those guys seem to have pretty interesting cases.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Or the part about I want to go represent insurance companies. I mean, if you could redo that, of course.
When people ask me that question in job interviews, I said, as a young lawyer, someone said to me, so much of the law is liking the people you deal with every day.
Who said that to you?
And it was a bankruptcy lawyer that said this. And she was talking about people in her office. Yeah. And she was in the bankruptcy part of this firm. And, she said, I love working every day with the people I work with. If we weren't all doing bankruptcy and we had to all start doing something else, I'd probably still like it because I like working with them. That's how I have to sell working at insurance sometimes to people is, look, it's interesting issues of law. A lot of it can be very repetitious. I tell people all the time, insurance law isn't harder. A lot of people want to make it out like it's harder than a lot of other things. And as much as that plays into, to my benefit of people thinking what I do is hard, The hardest part about it is, the attention to detail, right? Like you have to really be looking at the last antecedent rule or where that comma sits in that row, right?
Sure.
I mean, that's, a serious thing.
Yeah.
But I would say, what the advice to my younger self would be to do what I did, which is, I think it's what I did, is try to talk to the other lawyers. Don't just sit in your office, whether it's bar events or if you work at a firm where there's a lot of other younger lawyers, do that. And hopefully we're getting back out of this right now that people are back in the office. There used to be, we used to go to lunch. People in my office used to go to lunch every day, right? Everybody who was there, a group of people, and it doesn't have to be the same people, would go every day, right? And I learned so much as a young lawyer just listening to what the other lawyers were talking about. And that's also how you can get involved in some really interesting cases as an associate, right? If there's a couple of lawyers that are more senior than you there and they start talking about different issues, you can end up buying yourself a research assignment to work on something pretty interesting. I think that going to events is a really important thing. We encourage our associates to do that very, very much, to get involved, to give speeches, to write papers, to volunteer to do stuff. I think that's how you get outside of your comfort zone, which can be hard for some people, but I think that that's what you have to do if you want to excel at something. You have to not just learn it on your own or listen to the one or two people that are telling you what to do. You've got to broaden your worldview a little bit.
Sound advice. All right, Steve Melendi, this has been great having you as a guest on our podcast. Any last thoughts or questions for our guests?
I don't have any additional, thoughts that are relevant to this at this moment. I appreciate you letting me come on. One day, if I can, figure out all this technical equipment, have my own podcast, will you agree to come on my show?
I will. You have my word. So I can't wait. First, you got to find yourself an Emily, and those are very hard to find. So
probably
you may be out of luck on that. The microphones and the headphones. Yeah, those are pretty easy. But without Emily, none of this works. So thank you, Emily.
Yes, thank you, Emily.
And Steve, I hope you'll join us again. We probably will have repeat podcast guests. So it'll be like Saturday Night Live, where they have like how many times you've been on it, that kind of thing.
5-Timers Club.
Yeah, right. That Tom Hanks episode. That was a good one. So yeah.
Do I get a jacket?
Yeah. And some have been, as like musical guests and hosts and, all that kind of stuff. Some just appear on the Weekend Update. There's different roles. But yeah, stay tuned.
Could I be just the humor? Could we get somebody, what I'd like to see is to get somebody, who has a much more serious take on most of this stuff than you or me, and allow me to just pop in and feed obnoxious questions.
I'm willing to give that a try. I don't think I would want to sit through that, but I'm willing to consider it. So let's...
No, I don't want you to play the serious guy. I want you to act like this is a normal interview.
And you just kind of chime in with bombs.
Right.
Okay.
Something, I'm trying to think of what it would be. I don't want to give anything away.
I have a couple of ideas. Yeah, I think you may be thinking the same thing. All right, good. I think good. So that'll be round 2. Anyway, all right, Steve. Well, look, thanks for making time out of your day. I know you had a hearing this morning, and we appreciate you stopping by our office. We hope to see you back on our show again soon. And thank you again.
I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.